In her final days, in a small London flat, the woman once known as the world's most beautiful animal was paralyzed and broken. She spent her hours listening to old tape recordings, alone, hearing the voice of the man she had lost decades earlier, Frank Sinatra. The woman whose face had terrified studios and brought billionaires to their knees, the woman who had burned Hollywood to the ground, could now no longer get out of bed on her own. It was the final brutal price for a life that refused to be caged. This is not the story of a movie star. This is an autopsy of freedom. Ava Gardner was a force of nature dressed in silk and diamonds. She was an earthquake that rattled the foundations of a town built on artifice. She fought, and she defeated every man who ever tried to own her, from Mickey Rooney to Howard Hughes to Frank Sinatra. This is the story of what that victory cost her, and of the terrible echoing loneliness that comes after the last fire has gone out. The blueprint for the whirlwind lies in the stillness she came from. Ava Gardner wasn't born in a place so much as she was born in a condition. The place was Grabtown, North Carolina. The condition was poverty. She was born on Christmas Eve, 1922, the youngest of 7 children. Her parents, Jonas and Molly Gardner, were poor tobacco sharecroppers. This was the rural American South on the precipice of the Great Depression. Life was not about dreams, it was about survival. It was a world of dirt floors, outdoor toilets, and hard, repetitive labor under a relentless sun. The name Grabtown wasn't an official dot on a map. It was a nickname for the tiny farming community she grew up in. Located near Smithfield Life, there was elemental. Ava grew up running wild and barefoot, speaking with a thick Carolina drawl, so heavy it was almost incomprehensible. She was a stunningly beautiful child, but in Grabtown, beauty was not a currency, strength was. She was tough, scrappy, and had no illusions about the world. She was a dedicated tomboy, preferring to climb trees and play with her brothers than to play with dolls. She didn't own a pair of shoes until she was 13, and those were reserved for church on Sundays. This deprivation forged in her a basic truth. The world owed her nothing. It was this very lack that shaped her character. She had a brutal practicality. She was not a dreamer. As a little girl, she didn't dream of being a princess or a movie star. She dreamt of good food, nice clothes, and a solid roof over her head. She dreamt of security. That fragile security shattered when she was 13. In 1935, her father, Jonas, whom she adored, died of bronchitis. His death was a catastrophe. Without the man of the house, the family lost their sharecropping farm. They were utterly destitute. Molly Gardner, a woman of iron will, gathered what was left of her family and moved them to Wilson, North Carolina, a larger town. There she took a job as a housekeeper and cook at a boarding house for teachers, known as the Teacherage. Ava and her sisters helped out, making beds and washing dishes. This experience, watching her mother work her fingers to the bone to keep the family from starving, became the engine of Ava's life. It was that primal fear of poverty, an obsession that would never leave her, not even when she was the richest, most famous woman in the world. Decades later, lying in her luxurious London apartment, she would still dream of the dirt floors of Grabtown. That fear was the ghost that would haunt her. It also drove her one and only ambition. She had no ambition to be an actress. She didn't even know what that meant. She enrolled at Atlantic Christian College for Business, studying to be a secretary. It was a perfectly sensible job, one that promised stability. A salary of $15 a week was a fortune. That was all she wanted. A steady job, an escape from the uncertainty that had defined her childhood. But in 1940, at 18, she took a trip that would tear that simple life apart. She went to New York City to visit her older sister Beatrice, who was nicknamed Bappy. Bappy was married to Larry Tarr, a professional photographer. When Ava stepped off the train, Tarr was shocked. His 18-year-old sister-in-law wasn't just pretty. She was something else. She had a raw, untamed quality that the camera craved. Her face had perfect bone structure, flawless skin, and most importantly, her eyes, green with flecks of brown, held a strange combination of innocence and world-weariness. She looked like someone who had seen it all, even when she had seen nothing. Tarr couldn't stop taking pictures of her. He posed her in different dresses, taking dozens of portraits. Proud of his work, he placed a large, striking portrait of Ava in the window of his Fifth Avenue studio. That's where the legend begins. The story goes that one day, a man named Barney Doohan walked by. Doohan was a lowly legal clerk for Lowe's Inc., the parent company of the mighty Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer studio. He was not a talent scout. He was just delivering papers. But he stopped. He couldn't take his eyes off the photo. He went into Tarr's studio and introduced himself. According to the story, Doohan said, "You ought to send her pictures to Hollywood." Tarr, sensing an opportunity, lied. He said he couldn't because that girl was already an actress at MGM and he didn't want to step on his boss's toes. It was a smart gambit. It immediately put Ava in the same league as existing stars. Doohan, intrigued, said, "No, I work for MGM. I know all the stars. She's not one of them." Caught, Tarr confessed. She was his sister-in-law, up from North Carolina, and her name was Ava Gardner. Doohan asked for her number. The Tarrs, smelling money, moved fast. They sent a portfolio of Ava's pictures to the MGM office in New York. The response was immediate. They wanted a screen test. Ava, when she heard the news, was terrified. "They're crazy," she told Bappy. "I can't act. I can't even talk right." She went anyway. She arrived at the New York MGM office in a simple blue and white plaid suit. She was petrified. She was ushered into a room with a camera. A man told her to walk across the room. She walked. "Now," he said, "turn around." She turned. "Now arrange those flowers in that vase." She arranged the flowers. She didn't say a single word. She didn't have to. They knew as soon as she said hello with her thick southern drawl that she couldn't talk, so they filmed a silent test. That silent footage was sent 3,000 miles west to Culver City, California, and shown in a private screening room to the king himself. MGM studio chief Louis B. Mayer. Mayer was a tyrant, a sentimentalist, and a genius showman. He had built MGM, more stars than there are in heaven. By finding a specific type, he wasn't looking for reality. He was looking for magic. He watched the footage of the 18-year-old girl awkwardly arranging flowers. When the lights came up, Mayer gave one of the most famous orders in Hollywood history. "She can't act, she can't talk. She's terrific. Sign her." Terrific was the right word. It meant not just wonderful, but also, in its literal sense, to cause terror. Her beauty was alarming. Mayer didn't see an actress. He saw raw material. He saw a face that could sell tickets, regardless of what the woman behind it could or couldn't do. A contract was drawn up. A standard 7-year studio contract, starting at $50 a week. To Ava, it was an unimaginable sum. It was the security she had always craved, handed to her by a world she didn't understand. She went back to North Carolina to pack her few belongings and say her goodbyes. Her mother, Molly, was practical. "Don't let it spoil you, Ava," she warned. Drawing out her daughter's name, Ava promised she wouldn't. In 1941, Ava Gardner, 18 years old, accompanied by her sister Bappy, who would serve as her lifelong guardian and companion, boarded a train heading west. She was going to California, a place she only knew from movie magazines. She was heading into a world she could not possibly imagine, armed with nothing but a face that could stop traffic and a spirit that would, in time, stop the entire studio. When she arrived in Los Angeles, she was completely lost. She was, in her own words, the greenest of greenhorns. Hollywood in 1941 was the pinnacle of the studio system. It was not an art business, it was a production line. Studios like MGM owned their stars. They owned their names, their images, their personal lives. They were property. And Ava was MGM's newest, most unpolished piece of property. The studio machine immediately went to work, trying to sand down her rough edges. The first and most urgent job, her voice. Her voice was a disaster by studio standards. It was too thick, too southern, too real. They couldn't have their goddesses sounding like tobacco pickers. She was assigned to a voice coach, Gertrude Fogler. For an entire year, every single day, Ava did nothing but practice exercises, trying to flatten her drawl into the bland, sexless, mid-Atlantic monotone that was the standard for all studio actors. The drills were exhausting. The fat black cat sat on the mat. It was a daily humiliation. It was the first time she was told implicitly that who she was and where she came from was wrong. It was a wound that would never heal. For the rest of her life, she remained pathologically insecure about her voice, her intelligence, and her lack of education. She always felt like an imposter, a farm girl playing dress-up. For the first few years, she was just set dressing. MGM put her in over a dozen tiny, forgettable roles. She was car hop in one film, hat check girl in another. She was a beautiful face in the background, an item of studio inventory. She had no lines, or maybe one, drilled to remove any trace of North Carolina. She was called a starlet, but in reality she was a paid apprentice. She learned how to walk, how to dress, how to wear makeup. She was given a complete physical overhaul. Her hair was restyled. Her teeth were capped. Her eyebrows were reshaped. She was taught how to pose for publicity photographers. She was being molded. She hated it. She found it boring and lonely. She lived in a small apartment with Bappy, writing letters home and feeling desperately homesick. She did not belong, but she was there, and she was young, extraordinarily beautiful, and in the center of the universe. She began to explore Hollywood nightlife. She was a new face, and in Hollywood, a new face always drew attention. She didn't just meet people, she collided with them. And her first major collision was with the biggest star on the planet, Mickey Rooney. Rooney was the king of Hollywood. He was the #1 box office draw in the world, the energetic, charismatic star of the Andy Hardy film series. He was also a notorious, relentless womanizer. The story goes that Rooney was visiting a friend on the MGM lot when he saw Ava. She was just walking by. He stopped mid-sentence. "I've got to have that," he said. "I'm going to marry her." For Rooney, it was a boast. For Ava, it was the beginning of a brutal education. He pursued her relentlessly. Ava, then 19, still fresh from the farm, was overwhelmed. Rooney was 21, but he had the experience of a man twice his age. He was a tornado of energy, funny, charming, and completely self-assured. Ava was starstruck. "He was a whirling dervish," she later said. "He was the most talented man I ever met." But there was a problem. Ava, with her strict Southern Baptist upbringing, was still a virgin, and she had no intention of changing that before marriage. Rooney, accustomed to getting exactly what he wanted, was baffled and only more intrigued. He proposed constantly. Louis B. Mayer, acting as a surrogate father to his stars, called Ava into his office. He put his feet up on his desk and warned her against him. "He's no good for you," Mayer said. "He's screwing everything in sight." Mayer's warning only added to the excitement. Ava was in love, or at least she thought she was. She was mesmerized by his stardom. On January 10th, 1942, just weeks after her 19th birthday, They eloped to Ballard, California, a tiny town, and got married. MGM was furious. They wanted a massive Hollywood wedding, not a secretive elopement. It was a disaster from the start. On their wedding night, Rooney taught her to play poker. Then, she recounted, he spent the rest of the night on the phone with his bookie. The marriage was her brutal education in the realities of Hollywood. It lasted exactly 1 year. Rooney was a pathological philanderer. He was out all night, gambling and chasing other women, while Ava sat at home alone in their apartment. She was heartbroken, but she wasn't weak. The Grabtown girl knew how to fight. Their arguments were loud and physical. She learned that to survive, she had to give as good as she got. I had a temper, she admitted. He did too. They threw things. They screamed. After a year, she had enough. In 1943, she filed for divorce again. MGM was horrified. A divorce from their biggest star was a PR nightmare. They pressured her to stay quiet, to reconcile. She refused. She had learned her first lesson. No one was going to take care of her but herself. She walked away with $25,000 and her freedom. The marriage was short, but it was transformative. The naive girl was gone forever. In her place was a woman who was cynical, tough, and deeply suspicious of the men who claimed to love her. She was still a starlet, but now she had a name. She was Mrs. Mickey Rooney, which gave her a new level of notoriety, and she began to enjoy it. She threw herself into the Hollywood nightlife with a vengeance. She was a regular at Chiro's and the Macambo. She danced, she drank, and she learned how to handle herself. She was breathtakingly beautiful, and now she was experienced. She became part of Hollywood's fast set. It was during this time that she met her second husband, a man who was the complete opposite of Rooney. If Rooney was a case of physical infatuation, Artie Shaw was the reverse. He was a band leader and clarinetist. He was the great intellectual of the music world. Shaw was brilliant, complex, articulate, and terrifyingly arrogant. He had been married many times. Ava, still deeply insecure about her lack of education, was dazzled by his mind. He was my professor, she said. This was her attempt to better herself. If Rooney represented the glamour of Hollywood, Shaw represented the intellectual sophistication she felt she lacked. They married in 1945. This marriage, in many ways, was even more destructive than the first. It lasted just 13 months, and it nearly broke her. Shaw treated her as his personal Pygmalion project. He found her ignorance appalling and made it his mission to educate her. He forced her to read stacks of books, Das Kapital by Marx, Ulysses by Joyce, the works of Freud. Then he would quiz her on them, often in front of their sophisticated friends like Harpo Marx and Sinclair Lewis. It was a daily humiliation. He corrected her grammar in public. He mocked her taste. He made her feel hopelessly, irredeemably stupid. With Mickey, I was a child, she reflected. With Artie, I was a neurotic. The stress became so intense that she began developing psychosomatic illnesses. She suffered from insomnia. She was on the verge of a breakdown. Shaw, a firm believer in psychoanalysis, insisted she go into therapy. She went desperately to try and save the marriage, to try and become the intellectual woman he wanted. It didn't work. In 1946, Shaw abruptly left her for another woman, Kathleen Winsor. The author of the scandalous bestseller Forever Amber, Ava, was crushed. 2 marriages, 2 spectacular failures, all before she was 24 years old. She was at her lowest point. She believed she was a failure, that she was irreparably damaged. But it was at this exact moment, as her personal life imploded, that her professional life finally ignited. In 1946, an independent producer named Mark Hellinger was casting a low-budget film noir based on an Ernest Hemingway short story. He needed a true femme fatale, a woman who looked like an angel, but could lure a man to his doom. He had considered every major actress in Hollywood, but no one was right. Then, someone showed him a publicity still of Ava Gardner. He looked at that face and knew he had found her. MGM didn't want to loan her out. She was still their property, and they didn't see the potential. Hellinger begged. Finally, MGM relented, loaning her out cheaply. The film was The Killers. Her entrance is one of the most electrifying in film history. Burt Lancaster, in his debut role, plays the Swede, an ex-boxer waiting to be murdered. The film flashes back to how he got there. He hears a woman singing. He turns, and there she is, Ava Gardner as Kitty Collins, draped in a shimmering black dress, her back to the camera, before turning with a slow, devastating smile. She was terrifyingly beautiful. Her voice, still not her strength, was dubbed for the singing, but her eyes were not. Those eyes were 100% Ava. They promised everything and nothing. The film was a smash hit. The critics, who had previously ignored her, suddenly took notice. They raved about her sultry, smoldering beauty. Overnight, Ava Gardner became a superstar. The animal had been unleashed, and as she stood on top of the world, desired by every man in America, she met the third and final man she would ever marry, the man who would define her life, and the man who would help destroy it. She met him at a movie premiere. He was at the lowest point of his career. Considered a has-been, she was at her absolute peak. He was still married to his first wife, Nancy, the mother of his 3 children. His name was Frank Sinatra. He was Frank Sinatra, and his voice was the sound of America. First, it was the sound of naive yearning, the reedy baritone that made teenage Bobby Soxers faint in the aisles of the Paramount Theater later. It would become the sound of cynical experience, the bruised, boozy swagger of a man who had seen it all. But in 1949, when he and Ava Gardner truly collided, his voice was fading. His career was in a nosedive. His records weren't selling, his nice guy image was tarnished, and his film contract with MGM had been downgraded to cheap musicals. He was 34 years old and rapidly becoming a has-been. And he was married. He was married to Nancy Barbato, his childhood sweetheart, the mother of his 3 children, Nancy Jr., Frank Jr., and baby Tina. He was a Catholic, and divorce was not just a legal hurdle, it was a mortal sin. Ava Gardner, meanwhile, was 26 and at the absolute zenith of her power. Following the explosion of The Killers, MGM finally understood what they had. They put her in The Hucksters, 1947, opposite the undisputed king of Hollywood, Clark Gable. She was terrified. She was convinced her lack of training would be exposed. "I was so goddamn scared of him," she said. But Gable, a kind, professional man, put her at ease. On screen, their chemistry was palpable. The farm girl was now holding her own with the biggest star in the world. She followed it with a series of major films, One Touch of Venus, where she played the goddess of love herself, and The Bribe, another film noir with Robert Taylor. She was no longer a starlet. She was the star. She was the most desirable, most photographed, most lusted after woman on the planet. This was the dynamic when they met. He was the falling star. She was the rising one. They had circled each other for years. He had seen her on the lot when she was married to Mickey Rooney and had reportedly told a friend, "I'm going to marry that woman." But now, at a party at producer David O. Selznick's house, the timing was different. The air crackled. "I've been waiting for you all my life," Frank told her. Ava, cynical from 2 failed marriages, wasn't impressed by the line, but she was impressed by him. Underneath his flagging career was a raw, undeniable charisma. He was not a physically large man, but he filled a room. He was all nervous energy, intense vulnerability, and a dangerous, short-fused temper. In him, Ava recognized a kindred spirit. They were both, at their core, deeply insecure, passionate, and prone to violence. They were two sides of the same self-destructive coin. The affair began almost immediately, and it was not discreet. They were careless, consumed by a passion so total it erased all common sense. They were seen at nightclubs, at ringside seats at boxing matches, holding hands, gazing into each other's eyes. The press, led by the powerful gossip columnists Hedda Hopper and Luella Parsons, exploded this was the biggest scandal of its day. Sinatra was crucified. He wasn't just a movie star having a fling. He was a husband and a father, a Catholic who was publicly flaunting his adultery. The public turned on him with a vengeance. Women's clubs denounced him. Priests condemned him from the pulpit. He received thousands of letters calling him a monster. Ava was cast as the villain, the homewrecker. She was the Scarlet Woman, the Jezebel who had lured a good family man to his doom. The studio was terrified. MGM's entire brand was built on wholesome, family-friendly entertainment. Louis B. Mayer, who had once warned Ava about Mickey Rooney, called her into his office for a different kind of lecture. He demanded she end the affair. It was bad for her image, bad for the studio. This was the moment Ava Gardner truly broke from the system. She was no longer the scared 18-year-old. She was a 27-year-old woman in love, and she was the studio's biggest asset. She reportedly looked Mayer right in the eye and told him exactly where he could go. She was defiant. She would not be told who to love. This defiance came at a cost. The hate mail she received was vicious and terrifying. People threatened to throw acid in her face, but the public outrage only seemed to push Frank and Ava closer together into their own private world. "We were lovers forever, eternally," she said. "He was the love of my life." But their love was a 5-alarm fire. Their relationship was not tender, it was seismic. Their fights became the new legend of Hollywood, eclipsing their films. They were fueled by alcohol, professional jealousy, and a shared toxic insecurity. They screamed. They threw things. They threw everything: glasses, lamps, bottles of champagne. Frank, in a jealous rage, once threw her entire collection of jewelry out the window of a hotel. Ava, in response, threw his. There's a famous story of a fight at their Palm Springs home. They were screaming at each other, and Frank, in despair, took a revolver and fired it into the mattress. Ava, furious, grabbed it from him and fired it back. Another time, Frank, convinced she was seeing another man, flew into a rage and reportedly threw $10,000 in cash onto a fire. They were a spectacle. When they walked into a restaurant, the room fell silent, waiting for the show to begin, and it always did. The screaming matches in public were legendary. They would insult each other with a cruelty born of intimate knowledge, striking at every insecurity. His insecurity was his career. It was gone. In 1950, his record label, Columbia, dropped him. His longtime agent, George Bullets Durgam, quit. And then the final blow, MGM, the studio he had helped build, terminated his contract. He was unemployed. Ava, meanwhile, was at the peak of her earning power. She was the breadwinner. She paid for the cars, the houses, the lavish dinners. This dynamic was poison to Sinatra's famously fragile Italian-American ego. He became known around town, sneeringly, as Mr. Ava Gardner. This professional imbalance fueled his paranoia. Ava was sent on location for months at a time. In 1950, she went to Spain to film Pandora and The Flying Dutchman. Frank, left behind in Hollywood, stewing in his professional failure, would call her drunk in the middle of the night, accusing her of sleeping with her co-star, the bullfighter Mario Cabré. The accusations weren't entirely baseless. Ava, pushed away by Frank's jealousy and drinking, did have a public, passionate flirtation with Cabré, who wrote fawning poetry to her in the Spanish newspapers. When Frank read the reports, he went insane. He booked a flight to Spain immediately. Ava, hearing he was coming, drove out to meet his plane. The fight began on the tarmac and continued all the way back to their villa in Tossa de Mar. It was a storm of accusations and recriminations. They were killing each other, but they couldn't let go. The bond was too deep. Beneath the violence, there was a desperate, codependent love. He was the only man who, she felt, saw her as more than just a beautiful object, and she was the only woman who had ever truly matched his intensity. In 1951, after a long and agonizing public battle, Nancy Sinatra finally granted Frank a divorce. The Catholic Church was outraged, but he was free. Just days later, on November the 7th, 1951, Frank and Ava were married in a small ceremony in Philadelphia. She wore a simple mauve-colored dress. He was so nervous he reportedly had to be propped up. The press was held at bay outside. They were finally legally together. The marriage did not bring peace, it just legalized the warfare. Ava was now under even more pressure. She felt responsible for Frank's stalled career. She watched him sink into a deep alcoholic depression. He would sit by the phone waiting for it to ring. It never did. He talked about suicide. In 1952, Ava was given the biggest role of her career. Eloise Honey Bear Kelly in Mogambo, a massive Technicolor production to be filmed on location in Africa, directed by the legendary John Huston and co-starring her old friend Clark Gable. This was her chance to prove she was more than a pretty face, but it meant leaving Frank again for months. He couldn't stand it. Unemployed and paranoid, he flew to Africa to join her on set. It was a catastrophe. The remote, primitive conditions of the location camps only amplified their claustrophobic drama. The crew and other stars, Gable and a young, elegant Grace Kelly, were forced to listen to the nightly screaming matches that echoed from the Gardner Sinatra tent. Frank was a man undone. He was jealous of Gable. He was jealous of John Huston. He was jealous of the entire production. He felt like a piece of luggage, Ava Gardner's husband. Ava, for her part, was trying to work, trying to give the performance of her life while simultaneously managing a deeply unstable alcoholic husband. The fights were so bad that, according to some reports, Clark Gable himself had to step in and physically separate them. Then came the central hidden tragedy of their lives. In the middle of filming, in the remote wilderness of Kenya, Ava discovered she was pregnant. She was thrown into a panic. This was not the first time. She had been pregnant by Frank once before and had quietly terminated it. Now, it was happening again, in the most dangerous place imaginable. She knew, with the brutal honesty of Grabtown, what she had to do. She looked at the man she loved, this broken, volatile, unemployed man who could barely take care of himself. She looked at their life, a life of screaming, broken glass, and suicidal despair. "We couldn't even take care of ourselves," she said years later in her secret memoirs. "How could we take care of a baby?" She told no one except a trusted friend. She finished her work for the week. Then, claiming she needed medical tests for a fever, she flew to London. She checked into a hospital under an assumed name and had an abortion. Alone. She was back on set in Africa within a week. Frank never knew, not then. This was the secret she carried. She would later say it was the great regret of her life. She had 2 abortions during her time with Frank. The chaos of their love had made motherhood, the one thing she may have truly wanted, impossible. The guilt and the secrecy added another layer of poison to the relationship. She returned to Hollywood from Mogambo to rave reviews. She was nominated for an Academy Award for Best Actress. She had finally achieved the legitimacy she craved. Frank, by contrast, was at rock bottom. He had no agent, no contract, no prospects. He was a joke. It was Ava who saved him. She was at MGM, the queen of the lot. Frank heard about a role at Columbia Pictures, a low-budget adaptation of James Jones's blockbuster novel, From Here to Eternity. The role was that of Angelo Maggio, a scrappy, tragic Italian-American soldier. Frank knew this part was him. It was his last chance. But the studio, run by the notoriously crude mogul Harry Cohn, didn't want him. Cohn wanted a real actor, like Eli Wallach, so Ava went to work. She began a relentless campaign. She used her friendship with Harry Cohn's wife, Joan, to get invited to their dinner parties. She charmed Cohn, she begged, she pleaded. She used all of her power and influence as the biggest star in Hollywood to get her broken husband a screen test. The famous legend, immortalized in The Godfather, is that the mob put a horse's head in a producer's bed to get Frank the part. The reality is far more human. It wasn't the mafia, it was Ava Gardner. She was the one who made the offer they couldn't refuse. Frank got the part. He was paid a humiliating $8,000 for it. He flew to Hawaii, poured all of his rage, his humiliation, and his despair into the role of Maggio. The film was a masterpiece, and Frank Sinatra stole it. He won the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor. His acceptance speech was short. He thanked the studio, the director, and the author. He never mentioned his wife. His comeback was immediate and total. His career was resurrected from the dead, bigger than it had ever been. He signed a new massive contract with Capitol Records. He began to record the albums that would define his legacy, the swinging, sophisticated concept albums arranged by Nelson Riddle. He was once again the center of the universe. Ava's act of desperate love had saved him, but it was the final killing blow to their marriage. With his power restored, the old dynamic returned, only worse. He was Frank Sinatra, the voice, and he didn't need Mr. Ava Gardner anymore. The fights continued, but now he had the upper hand. He was on the road, performing in Vegas, recording in L.A. He was surrounded by adulation and by other women. The jealousy that had consumed him was now hers to bear. She would sit by the phone, just as he once had, waiting for him to call from Vegas or Miami. He was rumored to be seeing other women, including Kim Novak. It was unsustainable. They were both exhausted. They had burned each other down to the ash. In 1953, the end finally came. It was not dramatic, it was quiet. Ava was offered the title role in the Barefoot Contessa to be filmed in Italy and Spain. The role was almost too perfect. She was to play Maria Vargas, a beautiful, earthy Spanish peasant who is discovered by a Hollywood mogul, turned into a superstar, and finds only tragedy and death among the rich and powerful. It was her life story, recast as a European tragedy. She packed her bags, she left for Europe, and in a way she never came back. From Spain, a country she was beginning to fall in love with, she sent Frank a telegram. It was over. She was filing for divorce. The marriage had lasted only 2 years. The affair, the fights, the fire, it had all lasted just under 6. But the love itself would never end. It would become the ghost that haunted them both, the shadow that stretched across the rest of their lives. Ava was 31 years old. She was twice divorced, once widowed by love. She was at the peak of her fame, a Best Actress nominee, and she was utterly, profoundly alone. She had escaped Hollywood. She had escaped Sinatra. And now she had to figure out what was left. At 31, a Best Actress nominee and a global superstar, Ava Gardner had fled both Hollywood and Sinatra, the twin forces that made and nearly destroyed her. She landed in Europe, first in Italy, to begin filming the Barefoot Contessa, and from the moment she stepped off the plane, she knew she was home. This was not Hollywood. Europe, particularly the Latin world of Italy and Spain, was not afraid of her. It did not try to sanitize her, package her, or apologize for her. This was a culture that understood passion. It understood loud arguments in public, wine with every meal, and living life as an emotional rather than a practical experience. For the first time since she left the dirt roads of Grabtown, Ava felt she could breathe. The film, The Barefoot Contessa, was more than a role. It was a public exorcism. She played Maria Vargas, a beautiful, impoverished Spanish dancer discovered by a world-weary director. She is flown to Hollywood, polished, and turned into a superstar. She is surrounded by lecherous producers, empty-headed playboys, and neurotic billionaires. She rejects them all, searching for a real, authentic love, only to find tragedy and death. The parallels to her own life were staggering. It was the story of the world's most beautiful animal, caged by the very people who worshipped her. The film's writer and director, Joseph L. Mankiewicz, had tailored the part for her. He saw in her the exact combination of earthy peasant and tragic queen that the role demanded. Her co-star, Humphrey Bogart, was not impressed. Bogart was old-school Hollywood, a no-nonsense professional who distrusted movie stars built on beauty. He was famously gruff with her. When she's not being Ava Gardner, the star, he reportedly grumbled, "She's a pretty good actress." But his gruffness was a front. He, like everyone else, was captivated by her raw, unfiltered honesty. Her performance was astonishing. She wasn't acting, she was being. When her character Maria tells the producer, "The studios, the houses, the swimming pools, I hate them all," it was Ava's own voice, her own truth, coming through. The world saw a performance. She was living a confession. The film was a smash hit, and it cemented her new identity. She was no longer just a Hollywood star. She was a global tragic icon. After filming, she did not return to Los Angeles. She had found her paradise, and it was Spain. In 1955, she moved to Madrid. Spain in the 1950s was a country of contradictions. It was ruled by the iron-fisted ultra-Catholic dictator, Francisco Franco. It was a place of deep social conservatism and repression, but beneath that, it was a culture of fire. It was the world of flamenco, of fiesta, and of the corrida, the bullfight. Ava dove in. She bought a villa in La Moraleja, an upscale suburb of Madrid. She named it La Bruja. It became the center of a new, wild social scene. The parties at La Bruja were legendary, lasting for days. They were not the stiff, business-like gatherings of Hollywood. They were raw, drunken, and emotional. She learned to speak passable, if profane, Spanish. She learned to dance flamenco barefoot on tables at 4 a.m. in the tablaos of Madrid. She was adopted by the Spanish people, who saw her not as an American movie star, but as one of their own, a woman of duende, or spirit. And she fell in love with the most dangerous sport on earth, bullfighting. The bullfight for Ava was the ultimate metaphor for life. It was not a sport, it was a tragedy, played out in 3 acts. It was about courage, death, and a defiant, stylized dance with the inevitable. It was everything she felt her own life to be. And naturally, she fell in love with the most dangerous man in that dangerous world, Luis Miguel Dominguín. Dominguín was not just a matador, he was the matador. He was arrogant, beautiful, brilliant, and the undisputed king of the bullring. He was the Frank Sinatra of Spain. He had his pick of any woman in the world, from European aristocrats to Hollywood stars. He saw Ava and the two greatest, most combustible egos in Spain collided. Their affair was not a quiet one. It was a public spectacle, a national scandal. They were photographed everywhere. They fought in the lobbies of the grandest hotels and kissed passionately in the stands of the bullring. Domingin was engaged to a well-bred Italian aristocrat, but he could not stay away from Ava. This was a relationship built on pure animalistic passion. It was a contest of wills. He was perhaps the only man she ever met who was as vain and as confident as she was. He was beautiful, she said, and he was terrible. Their affair enraged the conservative Franco regime and the Catholic Church, but it thrilled the public. It was the peasant girl from Grabtown, now the Queen of Spain, taking the country's greatest hero as her lover. This was her life now. She was living the fantasy that Hollywood only pretended to create. She was at the center of a circle of artists and expatriates, including the one man who, she felt, truly understood her spirit, Ernest Hemingway. She had met Papa Hemingway years before. He had seen the killers and been mesmerized. He saw her as the living, breathing embodiment of his heroines. She was, to him, Lady Brett Ashley from The Sun, Also Rises, the beautiful, sexually liberated, and profoundly sad woman who was adrift in post-war Europe. They became deep, loyal friends. He called her daughter. She called him Papa. Their relationship was not sexual. It was something deeper. It was a bond of two people who loved drinking, loved bullfights, and were, underneath their tough exteriors, profoundly wounded. When Ava was with Hemingway, her insecurities about her education vanished. He didn't care that she hadn't read Ulysses. He cared that she had the courage to live, to face the bull of life. With him, she wasn't a dumb broad. She was a kindred spirit. This friendship was the intellectual validation that the abusive Artie Shaw had denied her. Her career continued, but it was now on her terms. She was no longer an MGM contract player. She was a free agent, one of the highest paid in the world, and she chose her roles based on where they were filmed. She had become a global nomad, chasing the sun, running from her ghosts. In 1956, she starred in Pawani Junction, filmed on location in Pakistan. It was a brave, challenging role. She played an Anglo-Indian woman torn between her British and Indian heritage during the violent partition of India. It was a physically grueling shoot, and she was magnificent, raw, angry, and complex. She proved yet again that she was far more than a face. Then, in 1957, came the role she was born to play. 20th Century Fox was producing a film adaptation of Hemingway's The Sun Also Rises. There was only one woman in the world who could be Lady Brett Ashley. The film itself was a flawed, overly glossy Hollywood production, but Ava's performance was its beating, broken heart. When she, as Brett, wanders through the Spanish fiesta, beautiful, drunk, and aching with a love she cannot have, it was impossible to tell where the character ended and the actress began. She was Lady Brett Ashley. She was the woman who had everything and nothing, the woman whose freedom was its own kind of prison. But as she lived this defiant, passionate life, the ghost of her past was never far away. Frank Sinatra was a permanent resident in her heart. Their divorce had not ended their connection. It was, as a friend said, the fight that was never finished. From her villa in Madrid, she would listen to his new records. He was in his golden age at Capitol Records, singing the saloon songs that would make him immortal, songs of heartbreak, loneliness, and regret, songs like One for My Baby. Ava knew those songs were for her. She was the woman in every bruised lyric. They would talk on the phone for hours in the middle of the night, their voices thick with alcohol and separated by an ocean. The calls were volcanic. They would scream, cry, hurl accusations, and then, invariably, end with, "I love you." Sinatra, though he was seen with hundreds of other women, remained obsessed. He tracked her movements. He knew about Dominican. He knew about her other flirtations. He would send lavish, unannounced gifts. When she opened a new film, a massive bouquet of flowers would be waiting. When she was ill, he was the first to call. He was her safety net. The one man she knew beyond all doubt would be there if she truly fell, and she was his great what if. The one woman who had matched him, the one who had gotten away. Theirs was the great tragic love story of their generation, a romance that could not survive marriage, but could not die with divorce. This reliance on Frank had a dark side. It meant that no other man could ever truly measure up. Her affair with Dominican, as fiery as it was, eventually burned out. He was a bullfighter, and he needed a wife who would be a traditional, supportive Spanish spouse. He married his Italian fiancée in 1955. Ava was, once again, alone. She continued the party. The 1950s blurred into a haze of late nights, flamenco, and an endless river of alcohol. She was still the barefoot Contessa, the Queen of Madrid. But the parties were getting louder, her voice rougher. The sun she had been chasing was starting to cast long shadows. She made another great film in 1959, On the Beach. It was a bleak, powerful drama about the last survivors of a nuclear war awaiting the radioactive cloud in Australia. She co-starred with Gregory Peck. It was a serious, somber role, and she was excellent. But her time on location in Melbourne was a public relations disaster. The press, accustomed to her wild Spanish life, hounded her exasperated. She gave them the quote that would define her difficult reputation. When asked about Melbourne, she said, "This is a perfect place to make a film about the end of the world." The Australian press was deeply offended, but it was pure, unfiltered Ava. She said what she thought. Consequences be damned. By the early 1960s, the Spanish dream was souring. She was approaching 40. The relentless pace of her life was catching up with her. The hangovers were lasting longer. The face that had been her passport was beginning to show the wear of a life lived at full throttle. She was also falling out of favor with the Franco regime. Her public drunkenness, her affairs, and her sheer, defiant disregard for their conservative rules were becoming an embarrassment. The government, which had once celebrated her, began to politely suggest that perhaps her taxes were not in order. The party was over. She was tired. She was tired of the noise, tired of the drama, tired of the bullfights. She was tired of being Ava Gardner. She left Spain, searching not for passion, but for peace. She moved to Switzerland for a brief time, but it was too quiet, too goddamn clean. And then, in 1968, she found the place where she would spend the rest of her life, London. She took a long lease on an elegant, unpretentious apartment in Ennismore Gardens, Knightsbridge. It was the perfect compromise. It was a big city, but one where she could be anonymous. The British, with their famous reserve, were happy to leave her alone. But before she could settle into this quiet final chapter, she had one more great performance left in her one more journey into the jungle. In 1963, her old friend, director John Huston, called. He was filming an adaptation of a Tennessee Williams play. The role was that of Maxine Falk, a lusty, loud-mouthed, and profoundly lonely hotel owner in Mexico. The film was The Night of the Iguana. In 1963, Ava Gardner was 41 years old, and she knew it. The Spanish sun, the rivers of wine, and the sleepless nights had begun to chart their history on her face. She was still, by any measure, one of the most beautiful women in the world, but the effortless, poreless perfection of her 20s was gone. It was replaced by something harder, wiser, and infinitely more interesting. Hollywood, however, was not interested in interesting. It was moving on. The 1960s were dawning, and the studio system that had built her was crumbling. A new generation of stars, the Jane Fondas, and the Julie Christies, was emerging. Ava was in danger of becoming a relic. And then the phone rang. It was John Huston. Huston was one of the few directors she implicitly trusted. He was, like her, a drinker, a brawler, and a defiant romantic. He had directed her in Magambo, and he saw what others often missed, the ferocious intelligence and vulnerability behind the animal facade. He was adapting Tennessee Williams's The Night of the Iguana, and he wanted her for the part of Maxine Falk. On paper, it was an insult. Maxine was not a glamorous goddess. She was a middle-aged, recently widowed, blousy hotel owner in Mexico. She was lusty, loud, grasping, and profoundly lonely. She was, in Williams's own words, a woman in her early 40s, attractive in a coarse, full-blown way. It was a role that other aging beauties would have run from. Ava ran toward it. She read the script and recognized the truth in it. She knew this woman. She was this woman. "I've only got one rule in acting," she once said. "Trust the director and give him heart and soul." She trusted Huston. The production itself became one of the most notorious in film history. Huston, in a stroke of genius or madness, decided to film it on location in Mismaloya, a tiny remote fishing village near Puerto Vallarta, Mexico. There was no infrastructure, no hotels, no roads. The heat was oppressive. The insects were relentless. And the entire cast and crew were trapped together in a humid pressure cooker. And what a cast it was! Huston had assembled a combustible collection of personalities. There was Deborah Kerr, Ava's old friend, playing the delicate, repressed spinster. Hannah there was Sue Lyon, the 17-year-old starlet fresh off her scandalous role in Lolita. And then there was Richard Burton. Burton, cast as the defrocked, alcoholic preacher, was at the very beginning of his epic, world-scandalizing love affair with Elizabeth Taylor. Taylor was not in the film, but she came with him. The global press corps descended on this tiny village, not for the film, but for Liz and Dick. The set was pure, magnificent chaos. Huston, presiding over it all like a mischievous king, famously handed each of his lead actors a gold-plated Derringer pistol and a box of bullets, each engraved with their character's name. It was, he said, for protection against the others. The atmosphere was thick with alcohol, drama, and sexual tension. The press was in a feeding frenzy over Burton and Taylor, who were fighting and loving with the same operatic intensity that Ava had once shared with Frank. For Ava, this media circus was a gift. For the first time in her life, she wasn't the center of the scandal. The spotlight was on someone else. She was free to simply work, and she worked. She shed her vanity completely. She allowed the sweat and humidity to plaster her hair to her face. She wore housecoats, not couture. She let her voice, now smoky and rough from decades of cigarettes and whiskey, crack with desperation. It was the performance of her life. The entire film hinges on a late-night scene between her and Burton. The two of them, drunk and sweating, sit on the porch of the hotel. Two broken souls confessing their loneliness to the jungle. Ava, as Maxine, is coarse and funny, but underneath she is aching with a loneliness so profound it's almost unbearable. She begs Burton's character to stay, not for love, but just for companionship, to have somebody to talk to. This was not acting. It was a baring of the soul. The Grabtown girl, the intellectual's punching bag, the movie star's wife, the bullfighter's lover, all of them were gone. All that was left was a 41-year-old woman terrified of being alone. The film was a massive critical and commercial success. The critics who had so often dismissed her as a face were stunned. They called her magnificent, brilliant, a revelation. She was nominated for a Golden Globe and a BAFTA. Many believe she was robbed of a second Oscar nomination, but it didn't matter. She had proven once and for all, to the world and to herself, that she was not a fraud. She was an artist. It was her peak, and in many ways, it was her end. After Iguana, what was left to prove? She was 42 years old. The 1960s were in full swing. She was old Hollywood. The roles being offered were no longer star vehicles. They were grande dame parts, cameos, or roles as the mothers of the new stars. She turned most of them down. She didn't need to work, she had made a fortune, and she was, for the first time, free. She continued her nomadic life for a few more years. She made the Bible, In the Beginning, 1966, for John Huston, playing the biblical Sarah. It was a respectable, if static, role. She appeared in the lavish, historical drama Mayerling, 1968, playing the Empress Elizabeth of Austria. She was elegant, regal, and beautiful, but it was a supporting role. She was drifting. The Spanish party was long over. The nomadic life had lost its charm. She was tired. She was tired of packing, tired of hotels, tired of performing. She was, as she had told her housekeeper on the day she died, tired. In 1968, she made a decision she was going to stop running. She was going to find a home. She did not choose Hollywood. She still loathed it. She did not choose Spain. The memories were too loud. She chose London. She took a long-term lease on a third-floor apartment, 34 Ennismore Gardens, in the wealthy, quiet, and discreet neighborhood of Knightsbridge. It was a spacious, elegant, but not ostentatious apartment. It was the perfect place for a movie star who no longer wanted to be one. This was the great contradiction of her final act, The World's Most Beautiful Animal. The woman who had lived her life as a public spectacle became a recluse. London afforded her a luxury she had never known, anonymity. In America, she was a legend. In Spain, she was an icon. In London, she was just another well-preserved, eccentric lady. The British, with their famous reserve, respected her privacy. She could walk her dog in Hyde Park, go to Harrods for groceries, or browse the local bookshops and, for the most part, be left entirely alone. Her life settled into a quiet, rigid routine. She lived with her beloved Welsh corgi, Morgan, and her fiercely loyal housekeeper and companion, Carmen Vargas. She would wake up late, often in the afternoon. She would read, watch television, and in the evenings she would begin to drink. Her apartment in Ennismore Gardens became her fortress. She rarely socialized. The whirlwind who had danced on tables in Madrid now spent her evenings at home in a comfortable chair with a drink in her hand. She was, as her character in Iguana had feared, alone. But she was not entirely cut off. Her one vital link to the outside world, to her old life, was the telephone, and her most frequent calls were to him, Frank Sinatra. Their connection had outlasted the fire, the marriages, the divorce. It had settled into something deeper, stranger, and more permanent than marriage. They were soulmates, tethered by a shared history that no one else could possibly understand. They would talk for hours late at night, a transatlantic line humming with alcohol, memory, and regret. She would call him drunk and lonely. He would call her just to check in. He was, in this final act, her greatest friend, her confessor and her protector. He was still, in his own way, managing her life. He tracked her finances. Ava, who had made millions, was financially careless. She was famously generous, supporting her family back in North Carolina her entire life. She was not destitute, but by the 1970s, she was not as wealthy as people assumed. Frank would quietly have his accountants fix her problems. He paid for her medical insurance. He set up trust funds. He sent her a regular large allowance, all under the guise of old business. When she was in the hospital for any reason, a room-filling display of flowers would arrive with no card. The nurses all knew who FAS was. She, in turn, was his anchor to a time when he was his most vital self. She was the one woman who had never been afraid of him, the one who had matched his fire. She was his great, beautiful regret. While her emotional life was centered on the past, her professional life became an afterthought. She still worked, but only for money or as a favor to a friend. The 1970s saw her enter the disaster movie phase, a common and lucrative pasture for aging Hollywood legends. She appeared in Earthquake, playing the alcoholic daughter of Lorne Greene. She was in The Cassandra Crossing, alongside other legends like Sophia Loren and Burt Lancaster. She even appeared in a bizarre Russian-American co-production of The Bluebird with Elizabeth Taylor. These were not great films. They were paychecks, and they were, in their own way, humiliating. The reviews were often unkind. Focusing on her aging appearance, the world's most beautiful animal was now a middle-aged woman, and the press was cruel. She felt the sting of every single slight. Her lifelong insecurity, the one that Artie Shaw had so carefully nurtured, had never left her. She genuinely believed she was an ignorant farm girl who had fooled the world with a pretty face. Now that the face was fading, she felt the fraud was being exposed. There is a devastating, perhaps apocryphal story from this period. She was in her apartment preparing to go out, a rare occasion. She was standing in front of the mirror for a long time, staring at her reflection. Her housekeeper, Rooney, found her quietly weeping. "What's wrong, Miss G?" Rooney asked. Ava turned, her eyes filled with a lifetime of pain, and gave the most honest, heartbreaking assessment of her own life. "I'm so beautiful," she whispered, "and I'm so alone." That was the core of it. Her beauty opened the door. But that same door would later lock her in. It had drawn men to her, but they were men who wanted to possess the animal, not understand the woman. And she, in her defiance, had pushed them all away. She became a symbol of loneliness behind the mask of beauty. She retreated further. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, she was a ghost. She was a living legend who was spoken of almost entirely. In the past tense, the parties at Ennismore Gardens stopped. She rarely left the apartment even to walk her dog. Her health, battered by a lifetime of hard, fast living, began to fail. Decades of smoking, 3 or 4 packs a day, had given her severe emphysema. Her breathing became labored. Her drinking, once a social lubricant, was now a private necessity. And that old primal fear from Grabtown began to creep back in, the fear of poverty, the fear of being old, sick, and broke. Frank was still sending money, but it wasn't enough to quell the terror. She was in her 60s, unemployable and ill. She had medical bills, she had staff to pay, she needed money, and she had only one thing left to sell her story. In 1986, she agreed to do the one thing she had sworn she would never do. She agreed to write a tell-all autobiography. She knew her life, her secrets, especially her secrets about Frank, were worth a fortune. She contacted a publisher who hired a ghostwriter, Peter Evans. She agreed to a massive advance. The old fear of poverty was, in the end, stronger than her loyalty. She began to talk, and for months, from her quiet London apartment, the woman who had become a silent recluse finally, devastatingly, found her voice. In 1986, the tape recorder began to roll. The woman sitting in the quiet of her Ennismore Gardens apartment was not Ava Gardner, the movie star. She was Ava Gardner, the 64-year-old invalid, the recluse who was, in her own words, broke or going to be. That old primal terror from Grabtown, the fear of poverty, had finally come to collect. It had driven her to do the one thing she had sworn she would never do: sell her story. And not just the glossy studio-approved story, but the real one her ghostwriter Peter Evans sat with her night after night as she drank, smoked, and finally talked. The voice that emerged from those tapes was not the honeyed, practiced mid-Atlantic accent from her films. It was a low, gravelly rasp, thick with a lifetime of cigarettes, whiskey, and a defiant trace of her original Carolina drawl. It was the voice of a woman with nothing left to lose. And she was devastating. She was brutally, shockingly, and hilariously profane. She was a storyteller who had been holding her tongue for 40 years, and now the dam was breaking. She settled every score. She spoke of her first husband, Mickey Rooney. He was I'm sure he was a fine man, but he was a serial. Let's just say he was never home. She dismissed him as a child. She spoke of Howard Hughes, the billionaire who tried to own her. She called him a goddamn lunatic, a psycho, and described in gleeful, vivid detail the night she knocked him cold with that bronze bell. "I've always had a temper, honey," she told Evans, and he was the first man to find that out. And she spoke of Artie Shaw, the intellectual bully who had tried to remake her. The bitterness was still raw, decades later. "He made me feel so goddamn stupid. He was always correcting me in front of everybody." The pain of that humiliation, of being made to feel ignorant, was still as sharp as it was in 1946. But the real currency, the reason for the massive book advance, was one man, Frank Sinatra. This was the line she had never crossed. For 40 years she had protected his secrets as fiercely as she had protected her own. But now she was sick, and she was scared of the bills. The Grabtown girl needed to survive. So she told Evans everything. She told him about the volcanic, violent, window-smashing fights. She told him about the insane jealousy that had consumed them both. She told him about the suicide attempts, his and hers. She told him, in a voice heavy with the smoke and regret of a lifetime, about the 2 abortions. She confessed the deepest, most defining secret tragedy of her life, that she had terminated 2 pregnancies because her life with Frank was too chaotic, too violent, too broken to bring a child into. "We couldn't even take care of ourselves," she said, her voice cracking. "How the hell could we take care of a baby?" She was building her own funeral pyre, note by note, confession by confession. She was finally telling her truth. And then, just as she was unburdening herself, fate, or perhaps the god of dramatic irony, intervened. In 1986, while in her London apartment, Ava Gardner had a massive stroke. It was catastrophic. She collapsed alone, or with only her housekeeper present. By the time she was stabilized, the damage was done. The world's most beautiful animal, the woman whose entire life was defined by her physical presence, was now partially paralyzed. She was confined to her bed in a wheelchair, and, in the cruelest cut of all, the stroke severely affected her speech. The voice that MGM had tried to erase, the voice that Artie Shaw had mocked, and the voice that was at last telling its own story, was now slurred and broken, almost silenced. She was helpless. A 64-year-old invalid trapped in her apartment, her great act of defiance, the book left unfinished. The news reached Frank Sinatra almost immediately. He, as always, knew everything. His reaction was swift, total, and defined the tragic contradiction of their entire relationship. He was both her savior and her censor. First, the savior. Frank, upon hearing of her condition, took complete control. He was horrified that she was being treated in London. He immediately dispatched a private, medically equipped jet. He had her flown, like royalty, from London to a specialist hospital in the United States, all at his own expense. He hired the best doctors in the world. When she was stable enough to return to London, he arranged for 24-hour, round-the-clock nursing care at her apartment. He paid for every single thing: the plane, the doctors, the nurses, the medicine. He paid for her life. The Grabtown girl would not die in poverty. Frank would not allow it. He was, in her darkest, most terrifying hour, her unconditional protector. And then came the censor. Somehow, perhaps from a nervous publisher, perhaps from Evans himself, Frank learned the content of the book she had been writing. He learned that she had told the secrets, their secrets, the abortions, the violence, the raw, unfiltered truth of their life. He was enraged. This was for him the ultimate betrayal. He, who was paying to keep her alive, was now being exposed by her. According to Peter Evans's account, the phone rang. It was not a friend or a lawyer. It was Frank Sinatra himself. His message was not a request. It was a command. Kill it. He threatened to sue Peter Evans. He threatened to sue the publisher. And, in the most devastating move of all, he threatened to sue her. Ava Gardner was trapped. The fighter was finally in a corner she could not get out of. She was physically paralyzed, her speech was gone, and the one man who was her protector was also her jailer. He was paying for her nurses, her bed, her very survival. And he was, in the same breath, threatening to destroy her if she crossed him. She had to make a choice, her truth or her life. She chose her life. The Grabtown girl, who had fought Louis B. Mayer, hit Howard Hughes, and walked out on Artie Shaw, finally surrendered. She called off the book. The tapes were put in a vault. The secret conversations were over. Ava Gardner's real voice was silenced, this time for good. But the great sad irony is that she still needed money. Not for her, but for her estate. She wanted to leave something for her family, for her housekeeper, Rooney. Frank's support was for her life, not her legacy. So a different deal was made. A new safe author was brought in, Glenn D. Wiles. Ava, now physically and emotionally broken, cooperated as best she could. The result was Ava, My Story, the official autobiography, published posthumously in 1990. It is a fine book. It is polite. It is the story of a movie star. It hints at the heartbreaks, but it never, ever screams. It is the book Frank would have been happy with. It's the story of Mogambo and the Night of the Iguana. It is not the story of the abortions, the bronze bell, or the gut-wrenching loneliness. It is a lovely, polished, and utterly inauthentic epitaph for decades. That was the last word. It wasn't until 2013, long after Ava, Frank, and almost everyone else from that era was dead, that Peter Evans, fulfilling his promise, finally published his original work. He titled it perfectly, Ava Gardner, The Secret Conversations. And there she was, her true voice rising from the grave, profane, funny, bitter, honest, and heartbreaking. Her final, truest testament had finally been heard. But in the late 1980s, Ava Gardner knew nothing of this future vindication. She was just a very sick, very tired old woman living in a quiet London apartment. Her last few years were a study in shadow. She was confined to her bed. Her world shrank to the four walls of her bedroom. Her corgi, Morgan, was her constant, loyal companion, sleeping at her feet. Rooney, her housekeeper, was her hands, her feet, and her voice. She would watch television for hours. She listened to music, especially Frank's records. He still called constantly, The calls were different now. The fire was gone. The screaming, the accusations, the late-night drunken recriminations, all of it had burned away. All that was left was a strange, deep, and quiet tenderness. They were two old, tired survivors, tethered by a bond that had outlived passion, marriage, and betrayal. They were, in the end, just Frank and Ava. By 1989, her lifetime of smoking had caught up with her. The emphysema was severe. Her lungs were failing. The paralysis from the stroke was permanent. On the morning of January 25, 1990, the end came. It was not a grand operatic Hollywood death. It was a quiet, simple fading. She was in her own bed. Rooney was with her. Her breathing was shallow. She looked at her longtime companion, the woman who had shared her lonely exile, and spoke her very last words. "I'm so tired." And then she was gone. Ava Gardner was 67 years old. The news flashed across the world. The world's most beautiful animal was dead. The headlines mourned the star of The Killers and Mogambo. But in California, a man mourned the woman. When Frank Sinatra was told the news, he collapsed. His daughter, Tina, found him in his room, slumped on the floor, weeping, unable to speak. For days he was inconsolable. His wife, Barbara, could do nothing. He would just sit and stare into space, whispering over and over, "I lost her. I lost her." Ava's body was flown home, back to the place it all began, North Carolina. She was buried in the Gardner family plot in Smithfield, under a simple stone, a world away from the Klieg lights and the Spanish fiestas. It was a small private funeral, just for the family. But the locals and the press who gathered at a respectful distance noticed something. Throughout the service, a single black limousine was parked on a hill overlooking the cemetery. No one got out. It sat there, silently, until the service was over and the grave was filled. Then it quietly turned and drove away. It was, everyone knew, Frank. He'd come to say goodbye to the woman he couldn't live with and couldn't live without. He was the protector and the jailer, the great love and the great wound, until the very end. Her death was not an end. It was a crystallization. It was the moment the whirlwind stopped and the world could finally, in the silence, begin to understand the sheer force that had passed through it. The woman who died in Ennismore Gardens was a 67-year-old invalid. But the woman who lived, the one who echoes in our culture, is eternal. To understand her legacy, we must look back at the pieces she left behind, at the contradictions that made her the most compelling and perhaps the most honest star Hollywood ever produced. The public saw the femme fatale. The press saw the animal. Her husband saw a reflection of their own egos. But the people who knew her saw a woman of shocking, almost paralyzing contradictions. Her most famous trait besides her face was her language. She swore with a fluency and creativity that could make a docker blush. This was not an affectation. It was a defense mechanism. It was the Grabtown girl building a barbed wire fence around her own vulnerability. When she first met the famously proper Deborah Kerr on the set of The Hucksters, Ava greeted her with a string of profanities. Kerr, an eminently intelligent woman, understood the test immediately. She replied with an even more shocking string of her own. They were instant, lifelong friends. If you couldn't handle her reality, you couldn't handle her. This shield was necessary because underneath it, she was still and always the girl Artie Shaw had called stupid. Her insecurity about her lack of education was a raw, open wound. She genuinely believed she was an intellectual fraud. She was terrified of interviews, terrified of being found out. This is what made her friendship with Ernest Hemingway so vital. He, the great intellectual titan of American letters, never once made her feel ignorant. He didn't care that she hadn't read Ulysses. He cared that she had the courage to live, to face the bull of life. He treated her as an equal, a daughter, not a dumb broad. His acceptance was the intellectual validation she had spent her entire life craving. And then there was the curse of her beauty. It was her passport out of poverty, her golden ticket. But it became her cage. Men did not fall in love with her. They fell in love with the idea of her. They fell in love with a face that launched 1,000 magazine covers. They wanted to possess the animal, to own the Contessa. Mickey Rooney wanted her as his beautiful, naive child. Bride Artie Shaw wanted her as his beautiful, educated muse. Howard Hughes wanted her as his beautiful, exclusive property. Frank Sinatra, the man who loved her most, still wanted her as his beautiful, passionate counterpart. She knew this. She felt it every day. It was the source of her profound, almost existential loneliness. She was, as one biographer wrote, the world's most famous lonely woman. This was the truth behind her devastating late-night confession in that London hospital, as she wept in the dark. I'm so beautiful, and I'm so alone. The face that had given her everything had ultimately isolated her. It drew everyone to her and allowed no one to get truly close. But to see her as a victim of this is to miss the point of Ava Gardner entirely. And this is where we must confront the central complex arguments of her life. How do we remember her? The narrative is tempting. A poor, uneducated girl from the sticks discovered for her face, exploited by a brutal studio system, and chewed up by a series of predatory, powerful men. And there is truth to that. Louis B. Mayer did treat her like property. Mickey Rooney was a cheat. Artie Shaw was an emotional bully. Howard Hughes was a dangerous stalker. Frank Sinatra was a controlling, jealous, and difficult man. But to paint her as a simple victim is to do her a profound disservice. It is to strip her of her agency. And Ava Gardner was, above all, an agent of her own life. She was not a passive figure. She was a fighter. She hit Howard Hughes with a bronze bell. She stood up to the most powerful mogul in the world, Louis B. Mayer, and told him to go to hell. She walked out on Mickey Rooney. She initiated the final split from Sinatra on her own terms from Spain. The more complex and more accurate argument is that she was a willing participant in her own chaos. She was drawn to fire. She matched Sinatra's volatility with her own. She was as addicted to the drama as she was to the love. This is the genius of Truman Capote's observation. She was the beauty who knew exactly what sin she was committing. She wasn't a woman who things happened to. She was a woman who made choices. She chose the difficult men. She chose the bottle. She chose the fights. She chose the chaotic, passionate freedom of Spain over the gilded, sterile cage of Hollywood. She chose at every turn to live, not just to exist. And she knew every step of the way that there would be a price. The second great controversy, the one that defined her professionally, was the debate over her talent. Was she just a face? The studio certainly thought so. For a decade, they typecast her as the beautiful thing. They put her in films like One Touch of Venus and told her to just stand there, to be the goddess, to be the animal. This argument is today demonstrably false. You only have to watch her in The Killers. She has barely any lines, but her physical presence, the slow, deadly smile, holds the entire film together. Watch her in the Barefoot Contessa. You are not watching a performance, you are watching an autobiography. The pain, the defiance, the weariness, it is all real. Watch her in On the Beach. It is a quiet, devastating performance of a woman who has given up and who finds one last brief reason to care. And above all, Watch her in The Night of the Iguana. This is her masterpiece. She is 3,000 miles from a glamour photographer. She is sweaty, coarse, desperate, and magnificent. The scene on the porch with Richard Burton, where she lays her loneliness bare, is one of the most courageous moments of acting in American cinema. Her talent was not theatrical. It was naturalistic. She couldn't fake an emotion. She didn't have the technical training of a Bette Davis. She had something raw, the truth. If she didn't feel it, she couldn't play it. This made her difficult for lazy directors, but it made her a genius instrument for a master like John Huston, who knew how to tap into her soul. The real tragedy of her career is that Hollywood was so blinded by her beauty, it rarely bothered to look for her talent. The final controversy of her life, of course, was her own story, the battle between the secret conversations of Peter Evans and the official version, Ava, My Story. It was the final proxy war between her and Frank Ava. My Story is the book Frank wanted the world to read. It's polite. The Secret Conversations is the book Ava Gardner lived. The 2013 publication of Evans's book was her final posthumous act of defiance. It was her last gravelly voiced, profane word. It gave her back her own narrative, a narrative that had been censored by the very man who paid her medical bills. It was the ultimate Ava Gardner contradiction. The man who saved her life was the man who tried to silence it. And in the end, her voice was just too strong, too honest to stay buried. So, what is her significance? Why, decades after her death, are we still so fascinated by her? Her legacy is not in her Oscar nomination, her list of films, or her famous marriages. Her legacy is the archetype she created. Ava Gardner was the first modern female star. Before her, stars were carefully packaged and sold as either good girls, June Allison, Doris Day, or bad girls, Bette Davis, Joan Crawford. These were studio-defined roles. They were fictional creations. Ava was just Ava. She was openly, unapologetically sexual at a time when that was scandalous. She was foul-mouthed, independent, and defiant. She refused to play the Hollywood game of pretending to be a saint. When she was caught in an affair with a married man, she didn't issue a tearful apology. She married him. She was the anti-Marilyn. Marilyn Monroe, the other great sex symbol of the era, was packaged as a fragile, tragic victim. Her narrative is one of a soft soul broken by the industry. Ava's narrative is that of a tragic fighter. She was never broken. She was just, in the end, worn out. She had a core of steel that Marilyn lacked. She took every punch and threw one back. Because she refused to apologize for who she was, she paved the way for every difficult woman who came after. She created the template for the stars who lived life on their own terms, who were messy and complicated and refused to ask for permission or forgiveness. Without Ava Gardner, there is no Elizabeth Taylor, at least not the one who publicly stole Eddie Fisher from Debbie Reynolds and survived the scandal. There is no Jane Fonda, no Angelica Houston, no modern star who dares to be complex and unlikable. Ava walked through the fire first, so they would only have to walk through the embers. The world's most beautiful animal was finally still. The hurricane that had torn through Hollywood, that had captivated and terrified men from Capote to Hemingway, was over. Ava Gardner's life was not a tragedy, not in the classic sense. A tragedy is about a fatal flaw, about a hero who has no choice. Ava's life was a testament to choice. She chose passion over peace. She chose freedom over security. She chose the raw, often ugly truth of reality over the beautiful, sterile illusion of Hollywood. She came from nothing, a barefoot girl from the tobacco fields of Grabtown. And for a glorious, fiery moment, she held the entire world in the palm of her hand. She drank it, She fought it, and she loved it, all on her own terms. She was the Barefoot Contessa, a title that was more prophecy than fiction. She was the peasant girl who became Hollywood royalty, and she never for 1 second let anyone or herself forget that deep down she was still that barefoot girl. In the end, she was not a victim of Hollywood. She was not a creation of the moguls. She was a force of nature that the world tried and failed to tame. She paid the ultimate price for her spectacular, defiant freedom, dying alone in a quiet London flat. But she died as she had lived, unapologetic, untamable, and until the very end, entirely, magnificently herself.